A boy was found unconscious in the garden of a mansion, holding a letter. Upon reading it, the millionaire could not hold back his tears. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Anne, a 65-year-old woman with grey hair and observant eyes, began her daily routine in the imposing English countryside mansion, where she had worked as a housekeeper for over 3 decades. Her footsteps echoed through the silent halls as she mentally listed the day's tasks. The mansion, a majestic structure of stone and glass, belonged to Thomas Durand, a millionaire known for his coldness in business and reclusiveness in his personal life. Anne was one of the few people who knew the nuances behind her employer's austere facade. As she drew back the curtains in the main sitting room, Anne frowned. Something in the garden caught her attention. A strange figure near the central fountain seemed out of place. What could that be? She murmured to herself, hurrying outside. The fresh morning air enveloped her as she stepped onto the dewy grass. As she approached the fountain, her heart began to race. It wasn't an object, but a person, a boy. "My goodness!" Anne exclaimed, running the last few steps. The boy, who appeared to be no older than 12, lay motionless on the grass. His pale face contrasted with his dark, disheveled hair. Anne knelt beside him, her trembling hands checking for vital signs. "Boy? Can you hear me?" she called, her voice shaking with worry. There was no response. Panic began to set in. How had he gotten there? What had happened? Anne noticed a crumpled piece of paper in the boy's hand. A letter. She hesitated for a moment, torn between curiosity and urgency. "James!" she shouted, calling the gardener who had just arrived. "Call an ambulance! Hurry!" While James ran toward the house, Anne tried to rouse the boy, speaking softly and checking for visible injuries. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. The sound of hurried footsteps announced the arrival of other staff members. In minutes, the once peaceful garden had turned into a scene of controlled chaos. "What is going on here?" a deep voice boomed. Anne turned to see Thomas Durand, still in his silk robe, his usually cold eyes now wide with surprise. "Mr. Durand," Anne stood up quickly. "We found this boy unconscious in the garden. We don't know how he got here." Thomas approached, his expression a mix of confusion and something Anne couldn't decipher. Concern, fear. "Is he—" Thomas began but couldn't finish the sentence. "Alive, yes," Anne answered quickly, "but unconscious. The ambulance is on its way." It was then that Anne remembered the letter. "He was holding this," she said, extending the crumpled paper to Thomas. The millionaire took the letter hesitantly, as if he feared its contents. His eyes scanned the lines quickly, and Anne watched with growing concern as his expression changed. Thomas's face, normally a mask of indifference, began to contort. His eyes widened, his mouth opened in a silent cry of anguish. And then, to Anne's absolute shock, tears began to stream down the face of a man she had never seen show any emotion beyond coldness or irritation. "Mr. Durand," Anne called softly, completely unsettled by the scene. Thomas seemed not to hear her. His eyes were fixed on the unconscious boy, an expression of pain and recognition overtaking his features. "Paul," he whispered, a name Anne hadn't heard in years, and that made her blood run cold. Before Anne could process what was happening, the sound of ambulance sirens cut through the air. Thomas, suddenly composed again, folded the letter and slipped it into his robe pocket. "Anne," he said, his voice rough but firm, "see to it that the boy is taken to the hospital. I need to make some phone calls." With that, he turned and quickly walked back into the mansion, leaving Anne speechless and more confused than ever. As paramedics arrived and began to care for the mysterious boy, Anne's mind swirled with questions. Who was this child? What did the letter say that shook Thomas so deeply? And, most importantly, what connection did he have to Paul Taris, Thomas's twin brother who had disappeared so many years ago? Anne watched the boy being placed in the ambulance, a sense of foreboding settling in her chest. The day had barely begun, and it already carried the weight of long-buried secrets ready to surface. As the ambulance departed, Anne cast one last look up at Thomas's study window. She could see his silhouette, phone in hand. Whatever the letter revealed, it was clear that life at the Durand mansion was about to change drastically. With a deep sigh, Anne prepared to face whatever fate had in store. One thing was certain. The secrets long kept within the Durand mansion were finally about to be revealed, and she would be there to witness every moment. Anne closed the door of the guest room where Simon, the mysterious boy, now rested after returning from the hospital. Her footsteps echoed down the silent corridor of the Durand mansion, each echo seeming to awaken long-dormant memories. She stopped before a window overlooking the garden, the place where, hours before, this entire story had begun to unfold. 30 years had passed in the blink of an eye, Anne thought, allowing her mind to drift into the past. It was a spring morning, much like this one, when Anne arrived at the Durand mansion for the first time. At just 35, with shining brown hair and eyes filled with hope, she climbed the marble steps, amazed by the grandeur of the place. "Welcome to the Durand mansion," said a deep, friendly voice. Anne turned to see two identical men descending the staircase. Twins, she realized immediately. Both tall, dark-haired, with penetrating eyes and impeccable suits. "I'm Thomas Durand," said the one on the left, extending his hand. "And this is my brother, Paul." Paul smiled warmly, a striking contrast to Thomas's firm, formal handshake. "I hope you'll feel at home here, Anne," Paul said, his voice gentler than his brother's. On that first day, Anne could never have imagined how different these two men, so alike in appearance, were in personality. Thomas, always serious and focused on business. Paul, warm and passionate about music and art. A sigh escaped Anne's lips as the memory faded. She turned, gazing down the corridor. Where silence now reigned, Paul's piano music once filled the mansion with life. But everything changed on that fateful night, 10 years after her arrival. Anne closed her eyes, memories flooding her mind like a torrent. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass, slamming doors. She remembered standing in the kitchen, paralyzed with fear, listening to the heated argument between the brothers. "You can't do this, Thomas." Paul's voice, usually so calm, was charged with anger and disappointment. "It's our family's inheritance." "Business is business, Paul," Thomas had replied coldly. "If you can't understand that, perhaps you should stay out of the way." The sound of furious footsteps, a door slammed hard, and then silence. A silence that would stretch for the next 20 years. The next morning, Paul was gone. No trace, no farewell note. Thomas claimed his brother had decided to travel, maybe to clear his head. But Anne always knew there was more to the story than Thomas let on. Rumors among the staff ran wild. Some said Thomas had thrown Paul out. Others whispered darker theories. Anne, however, remained discreet, watching the subtle changes in the mansion and its master. Thomas became more withdrawn, colder. Smiles, already rare, disappeared completely. The music that once filled the corridors gave way to oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional clink of whiskey glasses on Thomas's lonely nights. A sudden noise brought Anne back to the present. She turned quickly, finding Thomas standing at the end of the corridor, a shadow of the man she had known 3 decades ago. "How is he?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "Stable," Anne replied. "The doctors say he should wake up soon. They identified him as Simon. He's 12 years old." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the door to the room where Simon rested. "You noticed, didn't you?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Anne didn't need to ask what he meant. From the moment she had seen Simon in the garden, an unsettling feeling had pursued her. Now, seeing the boy clean and rested, the resemblance was undeniable. "He looks like Paul," Anne said, her voice barely a murmur. Thomas closed his eyes, as if the words had struck him physically. "Yes," he replied after a long moment. "Exactly like Paul at 12. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken questions and long-hidden secrets. Anne watched her employer, noticing the lines of worry on his face, the invisible weight on his shoulders. "Mr. Durand," Anne began, hesitant. The letter Simon was holding. What did it say? Thomas opened his eyes, staring at Anne with an intensity that made her step back. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd send her away as he had so many times before when she dared to ask too many questions. But then, to her surprise, Thomas spoke. The letter was from Paul. The shock of the revelation made Anne lean against the wall. Paul, alive, after all these years. Is he? Anne couldn't finish the sentence. Dead, Thomas completed, his voice choked. The letter, it was a farewell, and a request. Before Anne could ask more, a sound came from Simon's room, cutting off the conversation. A low groan, the creak of the bed. He's waking up, Anne said, moving quickly toward the door. Thomas, however, remained immobile, as if rooted to the spot. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fear, anxiety, a hint of hope. Mr. Durand, Anne called, her hand on the doorknob. Aren't you coming? Thomas looked at the door, then back at Anne. In his eyes, she saw the reflection of the young man she had known so long ago, frightened and uncertain. I'm not sure I can, Anne, he admitted, his voice almost inaudible. Anne felt a wave of compassion for her employer, this man who had carried so many secrets for so long. He will need answers, Mr. Durand, and you are the only one who can give them. With a hesitant nod, Thomas took a step forward. Together, they entered the room ready to face whatever destiny had in store for them. Simon, the boy who so resembled the ghost of Thomas's past, was about to awaken, and with him, all the secrets buried in the Durand mansion over 2 decades threatened to come to light, ready to forever change the lives of everyone involved. The silence in the room was palpable as Anne and Thomas watched Simon still asleep in bed. The soft sound of the boy's breathing was the only noise breaking the tension in the air. Anne cast a questioning look at Thomas, who seemed lost in his own thoughts, eyes fixed on the boy's face. Mr. Durand, Anne whispered, not wanting to disturb Simon. The letter, but what exactly did it say? Thomas blinked, as if waking from a trance. His fingers brushed his robe pocket, where he kept the letter. With a heavy sigh, he gestured for Anne to follow him outside the room. In the corridor, Thomas took the crumpled letter from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Anne noticed stains on the paper, which looked like tears. Read it, Thomas said, extending the letter to Anne. With a racing heart, Anne began to read. Thomas, if you are reading this, it means I didn't reach you in time. My brother, my twin, I know we parted under terrible circumstances, but I beg you to read until the end. I am dying, Thomas. An aggressive cancer that gives me no more than a few weeks, but I'm not writing for myself. I'm writing for Simon, my son. Yes, Thomas, you have a nephew. Simon is 12 years old, and he is the light of my life. He's bright, talented, and loves music as I always did. He is all I have left in this world, and now he will be alone. I know I have no right to ask this after everything that happened between us, but you are the only family Simon has. Please, Thomas, take care of him. Give him the home and family I can no longer provide. There's so much I wish I could say, so many explanations I'd like to give, but time slips away. I can only hope you find it in your heart to have compassion and care for my son, your nephew. Forgive me, brother, for everything, with love, despite it all. Paul. Anne finished reading, silent tears rolling down her face. She looked at Thomas, who leaned against the wall, eyes closed and features contorted with pain. Mr. Durand, Anne began, her voice trembling. Paul was alive all this time, and now he's gone. Thomas nodded slowly, opening his eyes to meet Anne's. I had no idea, Anne. All these years, I had no idea. The compassion Anne felt was quickly replaced by a wave of indignation. 20 years of silence, secrets, and a mansion plunged into shadows because of Paul's absence. How did this happen? She demanded, her voice firmer now. What really happened that night, Thomas? Why did Paul disappear? Thomas moved away from the wall, running his hands through his hair in frustration. It was a fight, Anne, a stupid fight about the company, about the inheritance. We said terrible things to each other. And then, Anne pressed, determined to finally uncover the truth. And then he left, Thomas exclaimed, his voice rising before he controlled himself again. He walked out the door, saying he wanted nothing more to do with the family, the inheritance, me. I thought he would come back, But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Anne watched him closely, looking for signs of lies or omissions. "You never tried to find him?" Thomas averted his gaze, guilt evident on his face. "At first, no, I was angry, hurt. When I finally decided to look for him, it was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth." Anne was about to ask more questions when a sound from the room interrupted them. Simon was waking up. They hurried back into the room, finding the boy sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Where am I?" Simon asked, his voice hoarse and unsteady. Anne approached carefully, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's all right, dear. You're safe. My name is Anne, and this is Mr. Durand. You were found unconscious in our garden." Simon looked from Anne to Thomas, his eyes widening further when he saw the latter. The resemblance to Paul was undeniable, and Anne could see recognition in the boy's eyes. You look like my dad," Simon whispered, his voice barely audible. Thomas took a hesitant step forward. "Simon, I'm your uncle, your father's brother." The words seemed to have a devastating effect on Simon. He shrank back in the bed, shaking his head vigorously. No, he murmured. "Dad said not to trust, to stay away." Anne cast a worried glance at Thomas before turning her attention back to Simon. "It's all right, dear. No one will hurt you here. Can you tell us how you ended up in the garden?" But Simon closed himself off completely, refusing to speak further. He pulled his knees up to his chest, burying his face in them. Thomas looked devastated by his nephew's reaction. He stepped back, as if afraid that his presence alone would make things worse. "Anne," he said quietly, "take care of him. I need a moment." Before Anne could respond, Thomas left the room quickly, leaving her alone with a frightened Simon and a mountain of unanswered questions. As she tried to calm the boy, Anne couldn't stop thinking about all the day's revelations. Paul alive all those years, now gone, leaving behind a son. Thomas carrying the weight of guilt and secrets. And Simon, clearly traumatized and distrustful. One thing was certain. The Durand family's secrets were far from fully revealed, and Anne was determined to unravel each one, for Simon's sake and for Paul's memory. With a sigh, she prepared for what promised to be a long and difficult journey of healing and discovery. The Durand mansion, which for so long had been a place of silence and secrets, was about to face a storm of long-buried truths. The days following Simon's arrival were a whirlwind of emotions at the Durand mansion. Anne, moved by a mix of compassion and curiosity, naturally assumed the role of the boy's caregiver. She spent hours in Simon's room, trying to earn his trust with kind words and small gestures of affection. On a particularly sunny morning, Anne entered the room carrying a tray with an elaborate breakfast. Simon, who had barely touched his food before, looked at the golden croissants and steaming cup of hot chocolate with interest. "Good morning, dear," Anne said softly, placing the tray on the small table beside the bed. "I thought you might like something special today." Simon hesitated for a moment before picking up a croissant. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice still timid. "My dad. He used to make hot chocolate for me when I was sad." Anne felt her heart clench. It was the first time Simon mentioned Paul willingly. "Your father sounds like he was a very caring man," she commented, sitting at the edge of the bed. Simon nodded, tears filling his eyes. He was the best dad in the world. Even when he got sick, he always tried to make me smile. Anne reached out, hesitant, and when Simon didn't pull away, she gently stroked his hair. "It must have been very hard for you, dear." The words seemed to open a floodgate. Simon began to talk, his voice broken by occasional sobs, about the last few months with his father. Sleepless nights, painful treatments, whispered promises that everything would be okay. "He made me promise," Simon said, wiping away tears. "Promise that I would come here, that I would find his brother. But he also warned me to be careful, not to trust completely." Anne frowned, intrigued by Paul's warning. What had happened in the past that made him distrust his own brother so deeply? Meanwhile, on the other side of the mansion, Thomas isolated himself further. Anne caught only glimpses of him, always looking tormented, always avoiding the areas of the house where Simon might be. One afternoon, frustrated by the situation, Anne confronted Thomas in his study. "Mr. Durand," she said firmly, "Simon needs you. He's your nephew, the last connection to Paul. Why are you avoiding him?" Thomas, sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk, looked as if he had aged years in a matter of days. "It's not that simple, Anne," he replied, his voice tired. "Every time I look at him, I see Paul. I see my mistakes, my regrets. But he's just a child," Anne insisted. "A child who lost everything and needs a family." Thomas closed his eyes, massaging his temples. "I know, Anne. I know. I just need time." Frustrated but understanding, she wouldn't get more from Thomas at that moment. Anne focused all her attention on Simon. It was during one of those afternoons, as they explored the mansion together, that she made a surprising discovery. They had entered the old music room, a chamber that had been closed since Paul's departure. A thin layer of dust covered everything, including the grand piano at its center. Simon stopped abruptly at the sight of the instrument, his eyes lighting up in a way Anne had never seen before. "May I?" he asked, timidly pointing to the piano. "Of course, dear," Anne replied, curious. Simon approached the piano with reverence, running his fingers gently over the keys. Then, to Anne's absolute astonishment, he began to play. Not random notes or a simple melody, but a complex emotional composition that filled the mansion with music not heard in decades. Anne stood paralyzed, tears forming in her eyes. It was as if Paul had returned, as if time had rolled back to when the mansion was full of life and song. "Simon," she whispered when the music ended, "that was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" Simon shrugged, a small smile on his lips. "My dad taught me. He said music was in our blood, a family gift." In that moment, Anne knew she had found a way to bring Simon and Thomas together. Music, which once united the twin brothers, could be the bridge to heal the wounds of the past. However, before Anne could form a plan, a new element came into play. She was preparing dinner when she heard the doorbell ring. Curious, she went to the entrance hall, where she found Thomas speaking quietly with a suited man she did not recognize. "Anne," Thomas called, noticing her presence, "this is Mr. Harris, my attorney. We have some important matters to discuss. Please ensure we are not disturbed." With that, Thomas and the lawyer headed to the study, leaving Anne with an uneasy feeling. What could be so urgent and secret that it required the presence of an attorney? Determined to learn more, Anne approached the study door silently, trying to catch fragments of their conversation. Words like custody, inheritance, contests reached her ears, heightening her concern. What was Thomas planning, and how would it affect Simon? Mind racing with new questions and worries, Anne returned to the kitchen. While preparing dinner, she could not stop thinking about how Simon's arrival had triggered a series of events threatening to unearth every carefully guarded secret of the Durand family. One thing was certain: the apparent peace of the mansion was about to be irrevocably shaken, and Anne was determined to protect Simon, no matter the cost. As night fell over the estate, bringing with it a heavy silence, Anne made a silent promise. She would uncover the truth behind Paul's disappearance, understand Thomas's motives, and above all, ensure that Simon found the home and family he deserved. The Durand mansion held many secrets, but Anne was ready to unravel them, one by one. The relentless ticking of the grandfather clock echoed down the empty corridor, marking the minutes Anne spent standing still, ear pressed to Thomas's study door. Her conscience screamed that eavesdropping was wrong, but her concern for Simon outweighed any moral hesitation. "The agreement still stands, Mr. Durand," the lawyer's voice filtered through the thick wood. "But the boy's arrival complicates matters." "I understand, Mr. Harris," Thomas answered, his voice tense, "but the payments must continue. We can't risk the truth coming out now." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. Payments? What truth were they hiding? "What about the DNA test?" the lawyer asked. "If the boy really is Paul's son?" "No," Thomas interrupted harshly. "No tests. Simon is Paul's son, I have no doubts. The sound of footsteps approaching the door made Anne back away quickly, her heart pounding. She retreated to the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of questions and suspicions. While preparing tea with trembling hands, a long-buried memory resurfaced in her mind, clear as if it had happened yesterday. It was a summer night, about 2 weeks before Paul disappeared. Anne was finishing cleaning the kitchen when she heard raised voices coming from the study. "You can't do this, Thomas." Paul's voice was full of anger and incredulity. "It's our family's money, not just yours. I'm the one in charge of the business, Paul," Thomas replied coldly. "You never cared about the company. Now you want to say." "Because you're siphoning off millions," Paul shouted. "Where's all this money going?" The sound of something breaking made Anne flinch. "That's none of your business," Thomas hissed. "If you tell anyone about this, I swear I'll—" The study door flew open suddenly, and Anne barely had time to hide. Paul rushed out, face flushed with fury. Thomas followed, grabbing his arm. "Let go of me," Paul broke free. "I won't stand by while you destroy everything our parents built." Paul stormed off, leaving Thomas standing in the corridor, fists clenched and a grim expression. Anne blinked, returning to the present. The teacup in her hands had gone cold. She didn't know how long she'd been lost in memories. Determined, she marched to Thomas's study, knocking firmly on the door. "Come in," Thomas's tired voice called. Anne entered, finding her employer behind his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his side. "Anne," he said, surprised, "what can I do for you?" "I want the truth, Mr. Durand," Anne declared, her voice firm. "About the payments, about what really happened with Paul." Thomas paled visibly. "What are you talking about?" "I heard your conversation with the lawyer," Anne admitted, "and I remembered the argument you had with Paul before he disappeared, about money diverted from the company." Thomas rose abruptly, his face a mask of fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he roared. "What happened in the past must remain there. Focus on caring for Simon and don't meddle where you're not wanted." The vehemence of Thomas's reaction took Anne by surprise. She took a step back, but held firm. "Simon deserves to know the truth about his father," she insisted. "Out!" Thomas shouted, pointing to the door. "And if I find you snooping again, consider yourself dismissed." Anne left the study, shaking with anger and frustration. She knew she had touched on something important, something Thomas desperately wanted to keep hidden. That night, Simon's screams echoed through the mansion. Anne ran to the boy's room, finding him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his pale face. "Simon, dear," she gently embraced him. "It was just a nightmare. It's all right now." "The bad man," Simon sobbed. "He was hurting my dad again." Anne's heart tightened. "What bad man, Simon?" "I don't know," the boy replied, trembling. "Dad was always scared when he talked about him. He said the man had done bad things, hurt many people." Anne frowned, a dark suspicion forming in her mind. Could it be that the bad man was... The next day, taking advantage of Thomas's absence and Simon's rest, Anne decided to investigate on her own. She entered Thomas's bedroom, feeling guilty but determined to find answers. After minutes of fruitless searching, she was about to give up when she noticed something odd. One of the floorboards seemed slightly out of place. Heart-pounding, Anne pried it up, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a carved wooden box. With trembling hands, Anne opened it, finding a series of old documents and a yellowed photograph. The photo showed Thomas and Paul, probably in their early 20s, smiling broadly. Between them stood a stunning woman with dark hair and bright eyes. The three looked happy, carefree, as if the world belonged to them. Anne turned the photo, noting an inscription on the back. Thomas or Sophie and Paul, summer of 1990. Sophie. The name hit Anne like lightning. She remembered hearing it whispered among the older staff, always with meaningful looks and half-spoken words. Who was this woman? And what role did she play in the complicated history of the Durand brothers? Before Anne could investigate further, she heard the sound of a car approaching. Quickly, she replaced everything, her heart pounding as she left Thomas's room. Descending the stairs, Anne knew she had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. The secrets buried in the Durand mansion were deeper and darker than she had ever imagined. With Sophie's image burned into her mind, Anne made a silent promise to herself and to Simon. She would discover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. For Paul's memory, for Simon's future, and for her own peace of conscience, she would unravel the mystery that haunted the Durand family for decades. The mansion might have been full of shadows from the past, but Anne was determined to bring it all to light. The game of secrets and lies was about to come to an end. The discovery of the old photograph had ignited a new flame of determination in Anne. She knew the answers to the mystery surrounding the Durand family lay hidden in the past, and she was determined to unearth them, no matter the cost. On a rainy morning, taking advantage of Thomas being at a business meeting and Simon still asleep, Anne locked herself in her small room at the back of the mansion. With trembling hands, she pulled out her old address book, flipping through its yellowed pages until she found the name she sought, Claire Wilson. Claire had been one of Anne's closest colleagues during her early years at the Durand mansion. She was there on the night Paul disappeared and, if Anne remembered correctly, had always seemed to know more than she let on. Heart pounding, Anne dialed the number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Claire?" "It's Anne, from the Durand mansion." There was a tense silence before Claire replied, her voice cautious. "Anne, after all these years, what happened?" Anne took a deep breath. "Claire, I need your help. It's about Paul." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice a tense whisper. "Meet me at the Willow Cafe in an hour." "Come alone." The Willow Cafe was a small establishment in the nearby town, known for its discretion and reserved clientele. When Anne arrived, she found Claire sitting in a secluded corner, a cup of coffee untouched before her. "Anne," Claire greeted, her eyes scanning the surroundings nervously. "I hoped I'd never have to speak about that night again." Anne sat down, leaning forward. "Claire, please. Paul's son is at the mansion now. He deserves to know the truth about his father." Claire's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded slowly. "Very well. But you must understand, Anne. What happened that night, it wasn't a simple disagreement between brothers." Claire closed her eyes, as if reliving the scene. "It was late. I was finishing cleaning the kitchen when I heard screams from the study. It wasn't unusual for the brothers to argue, but this was different." Anne listened intently, her heart pounding. "I approached the study door," Claire continued. "Paul was accusing Thomas of something terrible. He talked about money diverted, about lies and betrayals, and then he mentioned Sophie." "Sophie?" Anne asked, remembering the woman in the photograph. Claire nodded sadly. Sophie was, well, she was at the center of their world. Both of them loved her deeply. But that night, Paul shouted something about Thomas stealing Sophie from him. "What happened next?" Anne pressed gently. "There was a noise, as if something had been knocked over. When I looked through the crack in the door, I saw Thomas holding Paul by the collar of his shirt, pinning him against the wall. Thomas's face, and I had never seen such anger." Claire visibly trembled before continuing. "Thomas said something like, 'If you tell anyone, I swear I'll ruin you.' Paul managed to break free and ran out. That was the last time I saw him." Anne felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think Thomas "I don't know," Claire interrupted quickly. "I don't want to believe that. But in the following days, Thomas was different, cold, distant. He had bruised knuckles, as if he'd punched something, or someone." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelations hanging between them. "There's one more thing," Claire said finally. "The woman in the photo, Sophie, she disappeared around the same time as Paul. No one ever heard from her again." Anne's stomach churned. The implications were too terrible to contemplate. Thanking Claire for her courage, Anne returned to the mansion with her mind in turmoil. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit, but the picture they formed was dark and frightening. Entering the house, Anne was greeted by shouts from upstairs. Running up the stairs, she found Simon cowering in a corner of his room, and Thomas standing in the doorway, a look of shock and hurt on his face. "What happened here?" Anne demanded, placing herself protectively between Simon and Thomas. "I just wanted to talk to him," Thomas stammered, looking genuinely disturbed. But when I entered the room, he started screaming and backing away. Anne turned to Simon, kneeling beside him. "Simon, dear, it's all right. You're safe." Simon, trembling, looked at Anne with fearful eyes. "He looks like the bad man," the boy whispered. "The man who hurt my dad." Thomas visibly paled at Simon's words. Without a word, he turned and quickly left the room. Anne hugged Simon, her mind working furiously. The boy's fear, Claire's revelations, Thomas's erratic behavior, all pointed to a terrible truth she barely dared to consider. That night, after finally calming Simon and putting him to bed, Anne found herself standing at her bedroom window, watching the rain fall incessantly. The Durand mansion, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, now felt like a mausoleum of secrets and tragedies. Anne knew she was treading on dangerous ground. The more she discovered, the more threatening the situation became. But looking at the room where Simon slept, she reaffirmed her determination. The boy deserved to know the truth about his father, about his family. With a heavy sigh, Anne made a silent promise to Paul's memory and Simon's future. She would go to the end, no matter how painful or dangerous the path. The truth, long buried in the shadows of the Durand mansion, would finally come to light. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning dawned grey, as if the sky itself reflected the heavy atmosphere hanging over the Durand mansion. Anne hadn't slept well, her dreams troubled by nightmares in which Paul cried out for help, always out of reach. Determined, she headed to Thomas's study as soon as the sun rose. She found him already there, hunched over some papers, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his side despite the early hour. "Mr. Durand," Anne began, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "We need to talk." Thomas looked up, his tired, bloodshot eyes meeting hers. "What now, Anne?" "It's about Paul," she said, watching his reaction closely. "And Sophie." The effect was immediate. Thomas paled, his fingers tightening around the whiskey glass so hard Anne feared it might break. "What do you know about Sophie?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. Anne took a deep breath. "I know that both you and Paul loved her. I know there was a terrible fight the night Paul disappeared. And I know you're hiding something, Thomas, something big." For a long moment, Thomas was silent, his gaze distant. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. She was everything to both of us," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "Paul and I were always competitive, but with Sophie, it was different. We both loved her deeply." Anne listened intently, feeling she was finally nearing the truth. "That night," Thomas continued, "Paul accused me of manipulating the company's accounts, of diverting funds. He was partly right. I was moving money, but not for myself, it was for Sophie." "For Sophie?" Anne asked, confused. Thomas nodded sadly. "She was ill, Anne. A rare, aggressive cancer. The treatments were incredibly expensive, experimental. I was using the company's money to try to save her." Anne felt a wave of compassion, but remained firm. "And Paul?" "Paul found out. He was furious, not about the money itself, but because I hadn't told him about Sophie's illness. He felt I had betrayed him, trying to be the hero alone." Thomas paused, taking a long sip of whiskey before continuing. "We fought, yes, said terrible things, but I swear, Anne, I did not kill him. He stormed out of the mansion that night, taking a substantial amount of company funds. I thought he would return when he cooled off. But he never did." Anne studied Thomas carefully, looking for signs of deceit. There was genuine pain in his eyes, but also something else. Guilt, regret. "And Sophie?" she pressed. Thomas closed his eyes, as if the question wounded him physically. She did not survive. She died a few months after Paul disappeared. I lost them both, Anne. My brother and the woman I loved." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions and secrets still buried. Anne felt there was more, much more, that Thomas wasn't revealing. But before she could push further, a gentle, melodic sound filled the mansion. Someone was playing the piano. Thomas rose abruptly, shock etched on his face. "It can't be," he murmured. Together, they rushed to the old music room. There, seated at the piano, was Simon. His small fingers danced over the keys with surprising skill, producing a melody Anne immediately recognized. It was Paul's favorite tune, a composition he often played on summer nights when the mansion was still full of life and joy. Thomas froze at the door, transfixed. His eyes were fixed on Simon, emotions flickering across his face. Shock, recognition, pain, and finally a profound sadness. Simon, absorbed in the music, didn't notice their presence until he finished the piece. When he finally looked up, his eyes widened at the sight of Thomas. Where did you learn that music?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Surprisingly, Simon did not show the usual fear of Thomas. Instead, there was a certain melancholy in his eyes. "My dad taught me," he answered softly. "He said it was special, that it reminded him of home." Thomas staggered as if punched, leaning against the doorway. Anne watched him closely, noting the tears forming in his eyes. "He talked about this place," Simon continued, his voice barely a whisper, "about the brother he loved, but who hurt him deeply, about the woman they both loved." Anne felt her heart clench. It was evident that Paul, even far away, had never truly left the Durand mansion behind. Thomas took a hesitant step towards Simon. "Simon, I'm so sorry. For everything." To Anne's surprise, Simon did not recoil. Instead, he looked directly at Thomas, his eyes, so much like Paul's, filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "Dad said one day I'd understand," Simon said, "that sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the most. But that true love always finds its way back home." Simon's words seemed to break something inside Thomas. He fell to his knees, sobs shaking his body. After a moment of hesitation, Simon stepped away from the piano and cautiously approached his uncle. Anne watched, tears silently streaming down her face. It was a moment of catharsis, of pain, and perhaps the start of healing. But as she saw uncle and nephew united in their shared grief, Anne couldn't help feeling that there was still more to be revealed. Thomas's account of Paul's disappearance didn't completely match what she knew or what Simon had said about his father. The full truth was still out there, hidden in the shadows of the past, and Anne was more determined than ever to bring it to light, no matter the cost. As Paul's music echoed softly through the mansion, like a ghost from the past, Anne made a silent promise. She would find out what really happened that fateful night so many years ago. For Simon's sake, for Paul's memory, and perhaps even for Thomas's redemption. The journey to the truth was far from over. In fact, Anne felt it was only just beginning. The next morning began like so many others at the Durand mansion since Simon's arrival. Anne prepared breakfast, Thomas isolated himself in his office, and Simon practiced piano in the music room. The routine, though tense, had settled in. However, fate had other plans for that seemingly ordinary day. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion, breaking the morning's quietude. Anne, drying her hands on her apron, headed to the front door. Opening it, she came face to face with a woman who seemed to have stepped directly out of her oldest memories. Dark hair peppered with grey framed a face that, despite the passage of time, still held an ethereal beauty. Her deep blue eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. "May I help you?" Anne asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The woman smiled softly, a smile that didn't fully reach her eyes. "Hello. My name is Sophie. I'm looking for Thomas Durand." Anne felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Sophie, the woman from the photograph. The woman Thomas had said died years ago. "Please, come in," Anne managed to say, her voice trembling. "I'll call Mr. Durand." While Sophie waited in the entrance hall, Anne rushed to Thomas's study, heart pounding. "Mr. Durand," she gasped, opening the door. "Someone is here to see you. It's Sophie." Thomas, who was bent over some papers, jerked his head up sharply. His face paled, as if he had seen a ghost. "Impossible," he murmured. But when he reached the hall and saw Sophie standing there, regal and real, Thomas seemed to age 10 years in an instant. "Sophie," his voice was just a whisper. How You're alive? Sophie took a step forward, her eyes fixed on Thomas. Hello, Thomas. It's been a long time. The moment was interrupted by the sound of light footsteps. Simon, attracted by the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs. His eyes widened at the sight of Sophie. Aunt Sophie, he called, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. Sophie looked up, a genuine smile lighting her face for the first time. Simon, dear, it's so good to see you safe and sound. Thomas looked from Sophie to Simon, confusion evident on his face. You know each other, but how? Sophie sighed deeply. It's a long story, Thomas. Perhaps we should sit down. In the living room, with everyone seated and Anne serving tea with trembling hands, Sophie began her narrative. First, I must apologize, she said, looking directly at Thomas. I never meant to cause so much pain, but at the time it seemed like the only way out. What way out? Thomas asked, his voice tense. I thought you were dead, Sophie. The doctor said. The doctor lied, Sophie interrupted gently. At my request, Thomas, that night when you and Paul argued, I heard everything. Anne, seated in a corner, absorbed every word. Sophie continued, I knew about the money you were diverting for my treatment, and I knew Paul had found out. Your fight, it was terrible. I feared what might happen if it went on. Thomas closed his eyes, pain evident on his face. So you ran away with Paul? Sophie nodded slowly. Yes. That night, after you stormed off, Paul came to me. He was scared. Thomas, scared of what you might do, we decided to leave together. But why? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Why not tell me? Why let me think you were dead? Because I knew you would never give up, Sophie answered softly. You would have searched for us, used all your resources, and we needed a new beginning. Anne noticed Sophie avoiding direct eye contact with Thomas when talking about the escape. There was something more she wasn't saying, and all these years, Thomas pressed. You stayed together all this time. Sophie hesitated for a moment. Not exactly. Paul and we parted ways a few years later, but we kept in touch, especially after Simon was born. Simon, who had remained silent until then, spoke. Dad always said Aunt Sophie was our guardian angel, that she protected us from afar. Sophie smiled sadly at the boy. Your father was a wonderful man, Simon. He loved you more than anything in the world. Thomas seemed to be struggling to process everything. But why return now? After so long? Sophie's smile faded, replaced by deep sadness. Paul contacted me a few weeks ago. He knew he didn't have much time. He wanted to ensure Simon would be safe. Safe from what? Anne couldn't help asking. Sophie cast a quick glance at Thomas before answering. From the past. From the consequences of the choices we all made so long ago. Anne noticed how Sophie avoided certain details, how her eyes sometimes shifted. She was still hiding something crucial. Thomas, for his part, seemed to be in shock. His eyes never left Sophie's face and as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. Sophie, he said finally, his voice choked with emotion. I never stopped loving you. All these years, thinking you were dead. Sophie reached out, gently touching Thomas's face. I know, Thomas, and I'm sorry for all the pain I caused. But you must understand there were reasons beyond what you know. Anne watched the interaction, noting the underlying tension. There was a world of unspoken words between Thomas and Sophie, secrets still waiting to surface. As the conversation continued, with Sophie answering vaguely about the years that passed, Anne couldn't stop thinking about that night when Paul disappeared. What really happened? Why did Sophie seem so reluctant to discuss it? One thing was certain. Sophie's return had shaken the very foundations of the Durand mansion. Old feelings resurfaced, secrets threatened to come to light, and at the center of it all was Simon, a boy who carried the legacy of a complex and painful history. Anne knew that, despite the morning's revelations, there was still much to be discovered. The puzzle of the past was far from complete, and each new piece brought more questions than answers. As she watched Thomas, Sophie, and Simon now conversing with heavy emotion, Anne made a silent vow. She would discover the whole truth, no matter how painful. For Paul's memory, for Simon's future, and for the peace of everyone caught in this complex web of love, loss, and secrets. The past had returned to the Durand mansion, and with it, the promise that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the mansion's living room was palpable. Sophie had finished telling her story, but Anne could feel that there was still more left unsaid. With Simon finally asleep after the day's emotional turmoil, Anne decided it was time to press for complete answers. "Sophie," Anne began, her voice firm yet gentle, "there's something you're not telling us. Something about that night." Thomas, who had been sitting silently, looked sharply at Sophie. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Anne saw a flash of understanding pass between them. Sophie sighed deeply, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were filled with restrained tears. "You're right, Anne. There's more. Much more." "What really happened that night, Sophie?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie looked out the window, as if she could see the past reflected in the glass. "It happened so long ago, but I can still see it clearly, as if it were yesterday." Flashback, 20 years ago. The Durand mansion was quiet that night, except for the screams coming from the study. Sophie, who was in the garden, ran inside when she heard the sound of breaking glass. "You're a damn traitor, Thomas," Paul's voice echoed down the corridor. "How could you do this? Falsify documents to take everything?" Sophie reached the study door just in time to see Thomas, face red with anger, lunge at Paul. "You understand nothing," Thomas shouted. "I did what was necessary to save the company, to save our family." "Liar," Paul countered, holding a sheaf of papers. "This proves you diverted millions, and not just for Sophie's treatment, was it?" Thomas froze momentarily, and Sophie saw something change in his eyes. Fear. Guilt. "Paul," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low, "give me those papers." "Never," Paul responded, backing away. "I'll expose everything. Thomas, it's over." Then it all happened in a blur. Thomas lunged, trying to grab the documents. Paul dodged, but tripped on the rug. In his fury, Thomas pushed Paul hard. Sophie watched in horror as Paul fell, his head striking sickeningly against the edge of the mahogany desk. He collapsed to the floor, motionless. "Paul!" Sophie cried, rushing to his side. There was blood. So much blood. Thomas stood paralyzed, staring at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. I didn't mean..." Sophie checked Paul's pulse. Weak, almost imperceptible. "Thomas, we need to call an ambulance." But Thomas didn't move. His eyes were glazed, in shock. "If anyone finds out, everything will be lost. The company, our reputation." "Thomas!" Sophie screamed. "He's your brother!" That was when Sophie made the decision that would change their lives forever. Seeing Thomas's catatonic state and fearing for Paul's life, she took action. "Help me carry him," she ordered Thomas. Together, they carried Paul, still unconscious, to Sophie's car. She drove furiously to a small hospital on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes of society. He fell down the stairs. Sophie lied to the doctors. "Please, save him." Hours passed. Thomas stayed behind at the mansion, destroying evidence and cleaning up the blood, while Sophie waited for news. Finally, a doctor appeared. "He will survive," he said, "but there are complications. Severe memory loss. He may never remember who he is." At that moment, Sophie saw an opportunity, or a chance to protect Paul from Thomas, to give him a new life far from lies and betrayals. "Don't tell anyone he's here," she pleaded with the doctor. "It's complicated. I will take care of him." Back to the present. Sophie finished her narrative, tears streaming down her face. Thomas was pale, trembling slightly. You lied to me," he whispered. "All these years. I did what I thought necessary to protect Paul," Sophie replied. "You were out of your mind, Thomas. I feared what else you might do." Anne, who had listened in shock, finally found her voice. "So Paul survived, but with no memory." Sophie nodded. "I helped him start a new life far from here. Over time, some memories returned, but never completely. He knew he had a brother, knew of Thomas's existence, but the details remained hazy. "And Simon?" Thomas asked, voice choked. Paul met Simon's mother a few years later. When the boy was born, something stirred in Paul, a desire to reconnect, to understand his past. That's when he started asking me more questions. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 2 decades of lies, guilt, and regret. "Why come back now?" Anne asked gently. Sophie looked at her hands. Paul was dying. For real this time. His last wish was for Simon to meet his family, his past. But he feared the consequences of what had happened so long ago. Thomas got up abruptly, walking to the window. His posture was that of a man carrying the world's weight. "All these years," he murmured, "living with the guilt, believing that I had—" Sophie approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, is what happened that night was a terrible accident, but the lies, the fraud, that was your choice." Thomas turned, facing Sophie and then Anne. "I never wanted to hurt Paul. Everything I did, however wrong, was to try to keep our family, our legacy, intact." Anne watched them, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets and pain. There was so much to process, so many wounds to heal. "What do we do now?" Anne asked softly. Sophie looked toward the stairs, toward the room where Simon slept. "Now, we must think of Simon. He deserves to know the truth about his father, his family, but he also deserves a future free of these burdens." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice filled with determination, "to make it right for Simon, to honor Paul's memory." As the sun rose on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the three remained in the living room, united by the weight of the newly revealed truth. The past had finally emerged, bringing with it the promise of a new dawn for the Durand family. Anne knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Hope for healing, for redemption, and perhaps for a new beginning for them all. The dawn brought not only a new day, but the promise of a new era for the Durand mansion. The truth, long buried under layers of lies and remorse, had finally come to light. Now it remained to face the consequences and seek redemption. Thomas spent the morning in his study, immersed in thoughts and regrets. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red, and his posture, though still imposing, carried the visible weight of his past actions. "Anne," he called softly, finding the housekeeper in the kitchen, "could you please bring Simon? There's something I need to do." Anne nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Minutes later, she returned with Simon, who looked at his uncle with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Thomas knelt down before his nephew, so they were at eye level. "Simon," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something very important I need to tell you. About your father, about me, about the past." With Sophie and Anne present as silent witnesses, Thomas began his confession. He spoke about the fateful night, the fight, the accident, and the lies that followed. His voice broke occasionally, but he continued, determined to reveal the whole truth. "I made terrible mistakes, Simon," Thomas concluded, tears running down his face. "Mistakes that hurt your father, that hurt our family. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I beg you to understand that I deeply regret everything I did." Simon listened in silence, his eyes, so like Paul's, fixed on his uncle. When Thomas finished, the boy remained quiet for a long moment, processing all he had heard. Finally, to everyone's surprise, Simon reached out and gently touched Thomas's face. "My dad told me about you," he said softly. Thomas looked shocked. He did," Simon nodded. "In the last few weeks, before he left us, he said he remembered some things, good and bad. He spoke of a brother he loved, but with whom he had fought." Anne's heart ached as she saw Thomas's expression, an anguished mix of pain and hope. "He said," Simon continued, "that he wanted to make peace, that life is too short for grudges. He wanted me to meet my uncle, to understand that sometimes people make mistakes, but that family love is stronger." Thomas sobbed openly, pulling Simon into a tight embrace. "I miss him so much," he murmured between tears. So much. Anne and Sophie exchanged emotional glances. It was the start of something, a healing process that would be long but necessary. In the days that followed, the dynamic in the mansion changed visibly. At Sophie's suggestion, she stayed to help Simon adjust to his new life and to fill in the gaps of Paul's story. Anne took on the role of mediator, organizing moments for Thomas and Simon to spend time together, always supervising to ensure the boys' comfort. One afternoon, while Thomas and Simon played chess in the library, Anne watched discreetly. The initial tension had given way to cautious camaraderie. Simon laughed at Thomas's stories about Paul's youth, and Thomas listened attentively to the memories Simon shared. "You know," Thomas said, moving a piece on the board, "your father always beat me at chess. Looks like you inherited his talent." Simon smiled, a smile that so resembled Paul's it made Thomas's heart ache. He said chess was like life. Sometimes you make mistakes, but there's always a chance to fix things if you think carefully about your next move. Thomas nodded, moved by the wisdom in his brother's words, passed down through his nephew. "Your father was a wise man, Simon. And I'm trying to fix my mistakes now." True to his word, Thomas began taking concrete steps to correct past wrongs. He summoned a meeting with his lawyers and accountants, determined to restore the portion of the inheritance that belonged to Paul, and now to Simon. "I want everything done properly," Thomas instructed his advisors. "Simon must receive what is rightfully his, and I want to establish a charity fund in Paul's name, focused on helping underprivileged children." Anne, present at the meeting at Thomas's request, felt a mixture of pride and relief. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the Durand mansion. That night, as everyone gathered for dinner, a new tradition Sophie had established, Anne couldn't help noticing how the atmosphere had changed. There was laughter, lively conversation, and a sense of family that had been absent for so long. Thomas, seated at the head of the table, looked around and then fixed his gaze on Anne. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed deep gratitude. Anne smiled in response. She knew the path ahead would still be long and sometimes difficult. Deep wounds needed healing, trust needed rebuilding. But there, in that moment, seeing Thomas, Simon, and Sophie together, she felt a growing certainty. The Durand family, so long fragmented by secrets and lies, was finally on the path to healing and redemption, and Anne would be there, as she always had been, to guide them through this journey, step by step, day by day. The weeks following the revelation of the truth brought a palpable change to the Durand mansion. The heavy air of secrets and remorse gave way to an atmosphere of hope and renewal. At the center of this transformation stood Anne, quietly orchestrating the rebuilding of the family bonds that had been so cruelly broken. One sunny morning, Anne surprised Thomas and Simon with an unusual proposal. "How about a picnic in the garden?" she suggested, holding a wicker basket filled with treats. "The day is far too beautiful to stay indoors." Thomas, initially hesitant, looked at Simon, who nodded enthusiastically. "Sounds like a great idea," he agreed, a small smile forming on his lips. Anne led them to a shaded spot near the old oak tree, where Paul used to sit and read. As she spread out a checkered blanket on the grass, she observed uncle and nephew interact shyly. "Did you know your father loved picnics?" Thomas commented, helping Simon sit. "When we were kids, he always insisted on eating outdoors, even in winter." Simon smiled, his eyes shining with interest. "Really? Dad never told me that." The conversation flowed naturally from there, with Thomas sharing childhood stories and Simon absorbing every word, eager to learn more about the father he'd lost too soon. Anne stepped away discreetly, leaving the two to enjoy the moment. On returning to the house, she found Sophie in the kitchen, preparing a pitcher of lemonade. "How are they?" Sophie asked, her face a mix of hope and worry. "Better than I expected," Anne replied, smiling. "Thomas is trying, and Simon, well, he's incredibly resilient." Sophie nodded, pride shining in her eyes. "He's so much like Paul, not just in appearance, but in spirit too." In the days that followed, Anne continued to create opportunities for Thomas and Simon to grow closer. A Sunday afternoon of board games became a tradition. Walks in the garden turned into improvised botany lessons, with Thomas sharing knowledge he had inherited from his father. Sophie also played a crucial role in this reconstruction. Many evenings, after dinner, she would sit with Simon in the living room, an old photo album in her lap. "This is your dad at 16, she'd say, pointing to a faded photograph. It was when he won his first piano competition. Simon traced the photo's outlines with his fingers, eyes shining with emotion. "He looked so happy," the boy murmured. "He was," Sophie confirmed, her voice gentle with the memory. Paul had a joy for life that touched everyone around him. Thomas, passing by the living room, paused to listen. Anne noticed how his eyes softened at seeing the photo, decades of resentment replaced by bittersweet longing. It was during one of these memory-sharing sessions that Thomas made an announcement that surprised everyone. I've been thinking," he began, his voice betraying unusual nervousness. "Simon, I would like to officially adopt you." "If you want, of course." The silence that followed was deafening. Simon looked at Sophie, then at Anne, as if seeking guidance. "It's an important decision, dear," Anne said softly. "You don't have to answer now. Think about it." Thomas nodded quickly. "Yes, of course, there's no rush. I just wanted you to know that, well, I want to do this right. To be a real family." Simon was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. Finally, he stood up and, to everyone's surprise, hugged Thomas tightly. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas," he whispered. I would really like that." Anne felt tears forming in her eyes at the scene. It was a moment of healing, of new beginnings. In the days that followed, the Durand mansion underwent a physical transformation mirroring the emotional shift. Inspired by the new family dynamic, Thomas decided it was time to renew the space. "This house has been a mausoleum for too long," he declared one morning. "It's time to bring it back to life." With Anne and Sophie's help, heavy curtains were replaced by light, cheerful fabrics. Old furniture was restored, walls painted in vibrant colors. The old music room, long sealed, was reopened, and Paul's grand piano tuned. Simon, enthusiastic about the changes, asked permission to redecorate his room. Anne helped him choose bright colors and hang photos of his newly extended family. One afternoon, while supervising the installation of new shelves in the library, Anne found herself reflecting on the journey that brought them here. Her persistence in seeking the truth, her refusal to accept lies and half-truths, had been the catalyst for this entire transformation. "A penny for your thoughts," Sophie's voice pulled her from her reverie. Anne smiled, turning to face her friend. "I was just thinking about how much things have changed. A few months ago, this house was so empty. Now it's a home," Sophie completed, smiling back. "And that's thanks to you, Anne. Your courage in facing the past, your compassion, you brought this family back together." Anne felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "I only did what I thought was right, and that made all the difference," Thomas said, joining them. He carried a dusty box. "Look what I found in the attic. Old family albums. I thought Simon might like to see them." The three went down to the living room, where Simon was practicing on the newly tuned piano. Upon seeing the albums, his eyes lit up. As they settled on the sofas, turning pages full of memories, Anne felt a wave of gratitude. The Durand mansion, once a symbol of secrets and pain, now pulsed with life and possibility. Thomas, with Simon nestled beside him, recounted stories about the photos, his voice filled with affection and nostalgia. Sophie occasionally added details, filling gaps with her own memories of Paul. Anne watched, her heart overflowing with emotion. The truth, as painful as it had initially been, had set them all free. It had given Simon a family, Thomas a chance at redemption, Sophie peace of mind. And for Anne, it brought the satisfaction of knowing that her faith in truth and kindness had not been in vain. The Durand mansion, once a place of shadows and whispers, now resonated with laughter and the promise of a bright future. As the sun set outside, painting the sky in golden tones, Anne knew with certainty the familial bonds, once broken, had not only been restored, but strengthened. And she, the faithful housekeeper, had played a crucial role in this transformation. The journey was not over, of course. There was still much healing, much to build. But now, at last, they were all on the right path together. Autumn had arrived at the Durand mansion, painting the garden in shades of gold and red. Simon, now more comfortable in his new home, spent hours exploring every corner of the property. It was during one of these explorations that he made a discovery that would change everything once again. In the dusty attic, hidden behind old boxes and covered furniture, Simon found a small leather suitcase. Carefully, he opened it, revealing its precious contents, a collection of diaries, all written in his father's handwriting. "Uncle Thomas!" Simon shouted, racing down the stairs, clutching the suitcase against his chest. "Look what I found." Thomas, who was in the library with Anne and Sophie, looked surprised as the boy burst in, breathless. "What do you have there, Simon?" With reverence, Simon placed the suitcase on the table and opened it, revealing the diaries. "They belong to my dad," he said softly. "His diaries." An emotional silence fell over the room. Thomas reached out with a trembling hand, gently touching the covers of the journals. "I had no idea. I didn't know he kept diaries." Sophie stepped closer, tears shining in her eyes. "Paul was always the sentimental one," she commented, a nostalgic smile on her lips. Anne, sensing the importance of the moment, suggested, "Perhaps we should read them together." "If Simon agrees," was of course. Simon nodded eagerly. "Yes, please. I want to learn more about my dad." In the following weeks, evenings at the Durand mansion gained a new ritual. After dinner, everyone gathered in the library, where Thomas or Sophie read aloud selected passages from Paul's diaries. Paul's words, written over the years, revealed a deep and complex soul. There were entries about his childhood with Thomas, full of shared adventures and laughter, reflections on music, his eternal passion, and, of course, pages dedicated to Simon, overflowing with paternal love and pride. One night, Thomas read a particularly moving excerpt. Today, Simon played his first complete composition. As I watched him at the piano, I saw not just my son, but a living legacy of our family. Music has always been the heart of the Durands, and now, through Simon, it continues to beat. I only hope that one day he can share this gift with Thomas, that he can reunite our family through the notes that define us. When Thomas finished reading, tears glistened in his eyes. He looked at Simon, who sat at the piano, lightly running his fingers over the keys. "Simon," Thomas said, his voice choked, "your father was right. Music is the heart of our family. And I think I know how we can honor his legacy." In the days that followed, Thomas worked tirelessly on a new project. With the help of lawyers and consultants, he laid the foundation for the Paul Durand Music Foundation, dedicated to providing music education to underprivileged children. "I want Paul's talent, now living in Simon, to touch the lives of other children," Thomas explained during a family meeting. "This foundation will be our way of keeping Paul's spirit alive, spreading the joy he always brought through music." Simon, moved by the idea, immediately offered to give piano lessons as part of the foundation's program. "It's what Dad would want," he said, eyes shining with determination. Anne, however, surprised everyone with an unexpected suggestion. "What if we held a benefit concert to officially launch the foundation?" The idea was met with unanimous enthusiasm. Soon the Durand mansion buzzed with preparations for the event. Simon spent hours practicing at the piano, determined to make his father proud. Thomas immersed himself in logistics, transforming the garden into a concert-worthy venue. Amid all the activity, Thomas called Anne for a private conversation in his study. "Anne," he began, his voice serious, "you have been the pillar of this family longer than I can remember. Without you, none of this would be possible." He paused, searching for the right words. "I'd like to ask you something very important. Would you accept becoming the director of the Paul Durand Foundation?" Anne was momentarily speechless, moved by the offer. "Thomas, I'm honored, but are you sure? I'm not a musician." Thomas smiled gently. "You may not play an instrument, Anne, but you orchestrated this family's reconciliation. I can't think of anyone better to lead this legacy." With tears in her eyes, Anne accepted the position, feeling she had finally found her true purpose. As preparations for the concert advanced, another subtle transformation occurred in the mansion. Sophie and Thomas, united by their shared love for Paul and Simon, began rediscovering feelings they had long buried. One night, Anne found them in the garden, talking quietly under the moonlight. "We lost so much time," Sophie said, her hand gently resting on Thomas's. "Perhaps," Thomas replied softly, "but now we have the chance to make things right. For us, for Simon, for Paul's memory." Anne smiled to herself, silently withdrawing to give them privacy. Love, she thought, had mysterious ways of blooming, even from the ashes of tragedy. Finally, the day of the benefit concert arrived. The Durand Mansion's garden was magnificent, decorated with soft lights and lush flowers. A small orchestra occupied an elegant stage, and chairs had been set up for hundreds of guests. Simon, dressed in an impeccable suit, looked nervous but determined. Before going on stage, he hugged Thomas, Sophie, and Anne. "You are my family now," he said, voice thick with emotion. "And I know Dad is here with us too." When Simon sat at the piano and began to play, a reverent silence fell over the audience. His hands danced over the keys, producing a melody both new and strangely familiar. It was a piece he had composed, incorporating themes from his father's favorite compositions. Anne, watching from the front row, felt her heart fill with pride and love. Beside her, Thomas held Sophie's hand, both with tears in their eyes. In that moment, under the stars and guided by Simon's music, Paul's legacy was more alive than ever. As the final notes of Simon's composition echoed through the garden, Anne had a profound certainty. The Durand Mansion, once a place of secrets and pain, had been transformed. Now it was a home, a sanctuary of music and love, a living tribute to the man whose absence had brought them together in ways no one could have foreseen. Paul's legacy lived not only through Simon's music or the foundation bearing his name, but in the hearts of those he had touched. And as the night advanced, filled with music and promises of a bright future, Anne knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter in the Durand family's story. The Durand Mansion's garden glowed under the starry sky, transformed into a fairy tale setting for the benefit concert. Soft lights hung between the trees, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The murmuring crowd waited, filled with expectation, as guests settled into their chairs. Anne, standing near the stage, felt her heart pounding. Her eyes scanned the crowd, recognizing familiar faces and noting the presence of important community figures. Everyone was there to witness not just a concert, but the rebirth of a family. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the garden. Simon stepped onto the stage, walking with a confidence Anne barely recognized. Gone was the frightened boy who had arrived at the mansion months before. In his place stood a young musician, ready to honor his father's legacy. Simon sat at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys for a moment. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes of Paul's favorite piece floated into the air, and Anne felt tears forming in her eyes. The melody was familiar, but there was something new. Subtle touches Simon had added, making it his own interpretation of the beloved classic. As the music enveloped everyone, Anne looked around, watching the reactions. Thomas, sitting in the front row, kept his eyes on Simon, his face a mixture of pride and contained emotion. Beside him, Sophie held his hand, silent tears running down her cheeks. Anne realized at that moment how deeply each person present had been transformed by the events of the past months. Thomas, once closed off and bitter, now radiated a serenity Anne had never seen before. The years of guilt and secrets seemed to have lifted, replaced by a determination to do the right thing. Sophie, who had carried the weight of so many secrets, now looked lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Her smile as she watched Simon play was genuine and full of hope for the future. And Simon, the boy who had arrived frightened and alone, now shone on the stage. His music was not only a tribute to Paul, but a statement of who he was and who he was becoming. When the final notes of the music faded into the night air, There was a moment of reverent silence before the audience burst into applause. Simon stood, a radiant smile on his face, and bowed. Thomas climbed onto the stage, hugging Simon tightly before speaking into the microphone. The garden fell silent again, everyone awaiting his words. "Good evening, everyone," Thomas began, his voice slightly trembling with emotion. "I thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. This concert isn't just about music, it's about family, redemption, and new beginnings." He paused, looking at Simon and then at the audience. "Many of you knew my brother, Paul. He was not only a talented musician, but a gentle soul who touched everyone he met. For years, I made terrible mistakes that separated us. Today, before all of you, I want to ask for forgiveness, publicly." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Thomas continued. "Through Simon's music, through the love and perseverance of those around me, I learned the true meaning of family. The Paul Duran Music Foundation is not just a tribute to my brother. It's a promise of a better future, where music can unite people and heal wounds." Anne noticed tears in the eyes of several guests. Thomas's raw honesty was touching everyone. "Tonight marks a new beginning for the Durand family," Thomas concluded, his voice gaining strength. "A beginning based on love, truth, and forgiveness. I hope that, through our music and actions, we can honor Paul's legacy and make a difference in the world." When Thomas finished, the garden erupted in applause again. Simon ran to embrace his uncle, and soon Sophie joined them on stage. Anne watched, her heart overflowing with emotion, as the family she had helped bring together embraced in front of everyone. Thomas gestured for Anne to join them on stage. Hesitant, she climbed the steps, only to be pulled into a warm hug by Simon. "You are part of this family too, Anne," Thomas said into the microphone, his voice full of gratitude. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of music, laughter, and celebration. The foundation was officially launched, with promises of donations flowing in from all sides. Simon played a few more pieces, enchanting everyone with his talent. When the night finally ended and the last guests departed, Anne found herself alone in the garden. She walked to the spot where, months ago, she had found Simon unconscious, clutching that fateful letter. Gazing at the starry sky, Anne reflected on the extraordinary journey they had all taken. The love that had seemed lost had found its way back to the Durand mansion. The truth, painful as it was at first, had proven to be the catalyst for healing and forgiveness. Forgiveness had been the key to opening hearts long closed by time and hurt. "Anne?" Simon's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He approached, followed by Thomas and Sophie. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, concern in his voice. Anne smiled, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Never better," she answered softly. Simon took Anne's hand, gently tugging her. "Come on, we have champagne to celebrate." As they walked back to the mansion, now truly a home, Anne felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The Durand family, once broken and lost, had reunited and healed. The future, once bleak and uncertain, now shone with possibilities. The foundation would bring music and hope to many lives. Simon would grow up surrounded by love and support. Thomas and Sophie had the chance to explore the love they never had the opportunity to embrace before. And Anne knew she had found her true purpose. Not just as a housekeeper, but as the guardian of this reborn family, as the director of the foundation that would change lives. As they crossed the threshold, leaving behind the garden where it all began, Anne made one last silent reflection. The deepest wounds, the darkest sorrows, the heaviest secrets, all could be healed with love, truth, and forgiveness. The Durand mansion, once a place of shadows and whispers, now resonated with music and laughter, and under the starry sky, a reunited family celebrated not just the end of a special night, but the beginning of a new chapter full of promises and possibilities.